Good afternoon. At this time, we'd like to call to order the meeting of the Palo Alto Rail Committee of the City Council for Tuesday, November 21st, 2023. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Chair Burt.
Here.
Councilmember Vinker.
Here.
Councilmember Lowing.
Here.
For the record, all present.
Great. Welcome, everyone. At this time, first we give members of the public to speak on items that are within the purview of this committee, but not otherwise on the agenda. Do we have any speakers?
Chair, we do not have any requests to speak.
Okay. And next we have updates on interagency activities, generally led by our staff, but we also are pleased to have Caltrain staff with us. Ripon, any updates that you would like to share on Caltrain, VTA, or other city staff stuff?
Yes, we do have an update, and that was. Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. Ripon Bhatia, Senior Engineer with the Office of Transportation. We do have an update, and I was hoping Philip would join us, and he's on the way. But in the meantime, I can provide a brief update. First of all, we like to thank Caltrain and consultant staff who is present here. They have also provided us an update on comments on the conceptual alternative plans that were submitted to them for their review. So we have just recently received those comments, and staff is reviewing at our end on the technical level, and we will bring it back to the rail committee after we discuss these comments with them. Secondly, we are also happy to announce that we have also submitted some additional applications for the grant applications to Section 190 funds, and they were due back in late October. So we were submitted one for each of the grade separation crossing at Meadow, Churchill, and Charleston for the 24-25 fiscal year consideration. And now Philip has joined us, and I'll hand it back to him.
Yeah, sorry. So I might duplicate some of the things that Ripon's already shared, but I'm Philip Kami, Chief Transportation Official. So I'm Ripon, did you share the technical comments already? Okay. The VTA agreement. Okay. Yeah. So just to note that we had an amendment with VTA for their funding agreement to include the Caltrain review of that Ripon was just describing, and that was approved by VTA. Did you do the quiet zones? Okay. Okay, great. So yeah, I think I'm caught up now. Staff's working with the procurement department in acquiring the contract with the for professional services with the consultant to perform the quiet zone study at Churchill, Meadow, and Charleston. And also there's an agreement which was executed with Kimley Horn in order to provide support to continue the design for Palo Alto Avenue quiet zone. San Francisco Creek? No? Okay. Great. So we're continuing to coordinate with Caltrain staff, but and seems funny for me to talk about Caltrain while they're sitting here next to me, but they hired their contractor to perform the work. However, the permanent repairs are delayed until summer of 2024 due to permitting issues. And there was an emergency declaration that occurred on the 18th for the temporary bank stabilization efforts. And I'm sure you heard about boulders that are going in, but actually it's I believe bags of kind of boulders or bags of rocks kind of that'll be going in, and the crews will be working actually from starting yesterday and through tomorrow to prevent further erosion. And there will be regular inspections that will continue through the winter. And finally, Caltrain continues to collaborate with the cities and Stanford and the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority on this. And then sounded like I think the last one I caught was you were talking about the grant submission, and then I think we've covered everything then. Thank you.
And what were the dollars submitted on the Section 190 grants? And you might want to explain for folks what a Section 190 grant is. And then lastly, what we think our prospects are based on the criteria.
Good afternoon, Ripon Bhatia again. So the Section 190 is a state California Public Utilities program which funds construction of the grade separations for rail related corridors. And typically their maximum amount is $15 million in a given year. We have submitted $15 million for each of the grant application. This is our first shot. Usually it is for the construction, so we are not anticipating construction in the next 2 years, but hopefully this will enable us to stay on the list and be competitive as we move along our design and construction phasing of our different projects. So this also list also helps in getting some advantage when additional funding is sought from other sources. So having on the CPUC list of projects is advantageous for the city, not just from the perspective of getting funding, but from other prioritization criteria as well. Secondly, I think I answered both of your questions. So.
What, I'm sorry, the last one was how likely we think we are to get the funding. Is that?
Well, and I think Philip partially answered that in that because they're construction grants, we think it's not so likely we'll get it this year, but that based on the criteria that they use in terms of safety risks and other criteria, that when we are moving into being eligible for a construction grant, we think that we would rank well, and that getting on their radar now is an important first step. Is that a correct way to describe it?
Yeah. Yep. Perfect.
Okay. Is that it on the Caltrain side? Unless Caltrain folks have any updates. Navi, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I actually think Philip covered it all. So happy to answer any questions regarding any of the items that Philip brought up today.
Great. And then any VTA updates?
I provided that one VTA update was regarding the funding agreement.
Good. I'll just note one other VTA item. I've been having discussions with VTA and Caltrain, and we brought it up with Stanford about beginning to bring the 5 agencies together who have a shared interest on the Palo Alto intermodal station. At VTA, we're pushing forward to get the Dearborn station planning moving forward, which is really a collaboration between Caltrain and VTA and other bodies. But as I continue to point out to VTA that the Palo Alto station is today a more significant intermodal center than Dearborn is. Both in terms of Caltrain boardings and numbers of buses that go there. And there's a great deal of justified future planning on Dearborn, although the urgency is somewhat being mitigated by Google pushing out their horizon indefinitely on the Googleplex. So hopefully in the near term, we'll just begin to have informal discussions with the parties involved, who are Caltrain, VTA, Stanford, who owns land there, Samtrans, and leaving off no, but anyway, at least those 4. I thought there was a 5th agency: Stanford, Palo Alto, VTA, Samtrans, and Caltrain. 5 parties. So just to make it as complicated as possible. And there's also as the the Stanford Ad Hoc Committee, we're having additional discussions on the bus-only entrance into the station via Quarry from El Camino. And that issue needs to skirt some parkland, so it has that additional complexity, although there's a potential trading of land on that site. But we'll be having additional discussions going forward on that. But it looks like those discussions are becoming more focused. Any other staff updates?
No, thank you. That concludes our update.
All right, thank you. Okay, so then that lets us go on to the two items that we have today. First, a study session on the forward tracking analysis by Caltrain. We received a report that's in the packet that was provided, and Caltrain, I think, I don't know who's going to kick it off in terms of leading the discussion.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to kick this off. As everyone knows, that the forward tracking is an important issue in helping us to determine preferred alternative. And today we have Caltrain staff and consultant here to provide an update on the forward tracking analysis.
Thank you, Philip. Good afternoon, Chair Burt, Councilmember Lowing, and Councilmember Binker. My name is Nevi Dhaliwal, Government Community Affairs Officer at Caltrain, and I'm joined today by my colleagues on the Corridor Crossing Study Program, Jill Gibson and Edgar Torres, to present our forward track refinement analysis, specifically focusing on the facts and figures today. I want to preface this presentation in order to share that our team will be focusing on the forward track efforts specifically and are available to answer any technical questions related to this work. That being said, we're excited to share this work as the city continues to move forward in their conceptual planning efforts to further the locally preferred alternatives for Charleston, Churchill, and Meadow. We ask that questions regarding Caltrain's design criteria and engineering standards are asked outside of this forum, as the city has just received our preliminary review comments on the LPAs, and we are missing Robert Bernard, the Chief Deputy Design and Construction Chief of Deputy Design and Construction. As you may know, the City of Palo Alto City Manager shared a letter back in May of last year asking for knowledge and further analysis defining where the Northern Santa Clara segment would fall. Caltrain has since then done the homework in order to refine and provide results from our analysis indicating where the segment is operationally feasible to prepare for future blended Caltrain and high-speed rail service. We recognize this analysis will help provide additional clarity and support in the development of the city's locally preferred alternatives for the Connecting Palo Alto mega project. Without further ado, I will hand this off to our experts, Jill and Edgar, to introduce themselves and dive into the presentation. Thank you.
There we go. Good afternoon. I'm Jill Gibson with Kimley Horn. This is my colleague, Edgar Torres, also with Kimley Horn. So if you go to the great. So just wanted to emphasize before we kick this off is that, we're at this very kind of early beginning stages. And so today we're here to present the findings of our technical analysis and recognizing that there's a lot more conversation ahead of us in terms of the project development process. As you all know, there are many steps ahead through preliminary engineering and environmental. And so we're really at the very early beginning stages. So today we want to cover the forward track analysis, our overall approach, and just a reminder, this was done at the corridor level. And so we're going to share that with you. Edgar is going to talk through our operational considerations. Then we're going to dive into the forward track analysis, particularly within the city of Palo Alto and the various segments that were analyzed, and then talk about next steps and engagement. So our meeting objectives is really to review the forward track analysis and the approach, talk about the considerations and the trade-offs, review again the operational considerations and analysis, and then outline the northern Santa Clara County segments. So before we dive in, I think this slide is helpful to start in context of the track configuration today. So on the far left, on the top, you see San Francisco and a little bit about reading track charts as you work your way down left through right. You're going south towards Gilroy. And so currently today on the Caltrain corridor, there's a mix of 2-track and 4-track infrastructure. And in the early 2000s, to support the Baby Bullet service, 4 tracks at Bayshore and Lawrence were implemented. And so that's, I think, good context for this conversation about kind of the current lay of the land in terms of the track configuration. If you go to the next slide, this is a good summary of the adopted service vision 4-track segments that were included in our analysis, and were also included in the business plan from a couple of years ago, which we're going to dive in and summarize. And this slide shows, if you look where there is blue highlighted areas of adopted service vision 4-track segments, you can see centered around the Millbrae station, and then the Hayward Park Hillsdale station, also Redwood City, and then finally, the northern Santa Clara County segments. There are 4 options. You see that outlined A, B, C, and D. And so we're going to dive deeper today, but this is a summary of the adopted service vision 4-track segment layout. So if you go to the next slide. So the overall purpose of the 4-track analysis was to provide the location, the length, and the mileposts based on the 4-track segments identified from the Caltrain business plan. And so we define the required infrastructure to meet that 2040 long-range service vision. So you'll hear us refer to that as the adopted service vision for the blended service Navi mentioned for both Caltrain and high-speed rail service. And overall, this information is going to be used up and down the corridor to provide the cities the guidance to be able to implement grade separation projects. Great. So just a quick recap of the 2017 through 2019 business plan growth scenarios. So as a reminder, the adopted service vision included the moderate growth scenario, which included 8 Caltrain trains and 4 high-speed rail trains per hour per direction. There was also a high growth scenario that included 12 Caltrain trains and 4 high-speed rail trains per hour per direction. So the image on the left is the infrastructure associated with that moderate growth or the adopted service vision scenario. And the image on the right is from the higher growth scenario. And so today we're going to focus on our conversation really on the adopted service vision. So again, in summary, the image on the left, if you see the blue bubbles or rectangles there, those were identified from the business plan as areas to be conceptual 4-track segments that at the time was discussed to need further analysis to define the exact milepost length segment. So just that's kind of a bit of a refresher. And Edgar, go ahead.
Jill, just to clarify, on that a graphic on the left, you have the 3 that are in Millbrae, Hayward, and Redwood City that have been tentatively decided upon. And then you have 4 bubbles in the Palo Alto Menlo Park area, and those are the ones that are being considered. One has to be selected from among them.
Yeah, so I would say it this way, is that, and I think you're headed in the right direction, is that the areas defined in blue there, Millbrae, Hayward Park, Hillsdale, and Redwood City, were identified as the segments, and then our work validated that with more precision around the exact milepost links. But to your point really about the options there on A through D, you're correct in that our work took a, and Edgar's going to summarize this, took a hard look at the different options and really dove into the considerations and trade-offs for each segment to ultimately, we will need to have one segment to advance.
And you have the note there that says 1 4-track station needed in northern Santa Clara.
That's right.
County.
That's right. Thank you for that. Yes.
Yes.
One note here that we do have a bubble on the left-hand side of the screen. So the JPB, or the Joint Powers Board, the Peninsula Corridor Joint Power Board, cannot take action that makes materially more complicated or more complex the implementation of high-speed rail. And this is due to a funding agreement in order to electrify the corridor. So this was part of that commitment to achieve that funding and realize the electrified peninsula. So in the
I'm sorry, can we dwell a little bit on what that means? So is it correct that basically as part of the funding agreement by which high-speed rail provided a good portion of funds for electrification, Caltrain has to have plans that would allow for accommodating a future high-speed rail on the peninsula, this 4 trains an hour that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I would put it in a different context, in the sense that Caltrain can't make a decision that would preclude or make materially more complicated. So it's not necessarily having specific plans, but to be able to at least accommodate and prepare for a blended service in the corridor.
And in terms of 4-track, is it correct that that doesn't mean you're going to construct 4 tracks at these locations at this time, but you have to make sure that Caltrain and the cities don't do things that preclude the potential to put 4 tracks at those locations?
That is an accurate representation.
Okay, thanks.
For the initial planning of the 4-track, really comes down to these 3 criteria: being able to test what the 4-track will do, evaluate, and refine. So in terms of testing it, we did look at the horizontal layouts, being able to understand what that footprint could be and be able to understand those high-level trade-offs of a horizontal layout, because we're going from 2 tracks to 4 tracks. More space will be needed to be able to accommodate it, and be able to accommodate those transitions from 2 to 4 track. And really trying to avoid, where possible, major constraints, but really understanding that utilizing Caltrain and high-speed rail criteria, as there's going to be higher speed trains, not just high-speed rail, but Caltrain looking to have higher speed trains in the corridor, the express service, namely. And so during the development of that, we really looked at that criteria, being able to place it within the context of the corridor, and be able to then see, okay, what does that mean? What are the extents of that 4-track? What do those transitions look like? And does that meet the operational needs of the adopted service vision put forward by the JPB board? And that was a really important item, to be able to validate that, and therefore be able to say, yes, there is confidence that these segments can function, and therefore be able to be refined. And that was the subsequent step, to be able to refine that, and working with our team member, Deutsche Bahn Engineering, applying the principles from Germany and Swiss railways, to be able to, again, be able to have multiple types of services within the corridor. And I make that distinction because we will see, what does that mean when you have different types of services in the corridor, and be able to make them function effectively for each of the customers utilizing that service. So that's the important element. And really, I show that triangle at the on the right-hand side of being able to understand the trade-offs between service, right-of-way, and engineering criteria. These 3 have to work in concert, so that we're able to understand those trade-offs. Again, we're in the early stages of feasibility and due diligence, and be able to understand those trade-offs to then be able to say, okay, what does that mean, and how to be able to move forward at the appropriate time. As it relates to North Santa Clara County segments, these segments, we really focused on the trade-offs between those 3 vertices of the triangle: operations, right-of-way, and design, or service / operations. I'll make that distinction for this group: service from the perspective of the customer, operations from the perspective of the railroad operator. Working towards reducing those potential impacts to the surrounding environment: grade crossings, adjacent land uses, buildings, infrastructure such as interchanges or bridges. Identifying and understanding the interdependencies between how the platform is located, the fact that you have express high-speed trains of 110 miles per hour, and then effectively we start getting to rail design, the turnouts. How do you get a train to go from one track to the other? And really focused on the horizontal configuration of that. We considered the vertical profile, how the railway could adjust upward or downward. However, we really focused on the horizontal footprint to be able to start there and then be able to then have the conversations as appropriate as next steps. In terms of the operations considerations, let's go through the assumptions first, because this is important, is because we did do some modeling and simulation with this analysis along with the engineering, but it's going to be important to understand some of these components. And please feel free, if you have any questions, please feel free to interject. First is the headway separation. So headway is simply the space of time or time between trains. And this is a 2-minute minimum corridor separation. I'll note today it is 4 minutes. So it's part of these assumptions of the 2-minute separation between any two trains. The turnaround time, so this is where the train is at the terminal and is needing to turn around to go the opposite direction, is 20 minutes for both high-speed rail and Caltrain. This is important to be able to understand how trains can go up and down the peninsula as efficiently as possible.
Just, is it correct that on this minimum corridor separation time that we're currently at 4 minutes, future is 2 minutes, and by going to 2 minutes, it actually reduces the length of a 4-track system because we can have a tighter merging, and so that's actually in favor. That works in favor of minimizing the 4-track segment.
Absolutely. If we needed to have 4-minute separation, that distance would have to be larger. And please note that at 110 miles per hour versus say 70 miles per hour, that distance becomes longer. So that's an astute observation there.
And is that empowered or enabled to a great degree by the positive train control, or what other factors enable us to go from 4 to 2 minutes?
So positive train control is one component, but another key component, a key assumption here that we'll also bring forward in the presentation is an upgrade to the signaling system. This would not be only at the 4-track segment, it would have to be corridor wide for the signaling system as a whole to be able to accommodate 2-minute separation. Because the 4-track segment is not just the operation of that one segment, it's in the context of the corridor. And that's the important context, is that the train is not just going through one segment, it's working up and down the corridor, and how one segment can have an influence on others.
And is it also correct that the ability to accelerate faster from electrified trains is another crucial aspect of, because the train at the stop has got to get up to speed more quickly than we could today with diesel, but with electrified trains, they can be at closer to comparable speed more quickly.
Yes, and that is one key component assumption here is in the rolling stock, or the fourth row of this table, is the again, for Caltrain and high-speed rail trains, it would be a electrified motorized unit versus a diesel, and the acceleration rate of that EMU is much faster.
And Caltrain's going to run at a top speed on our corridor similar to what our Caltrain trains are running at. So they're not at different speeds.
Correct. So and we'll get a little bit into this as we go into the presentation. Each segment, depending on the geometry and depending on the location of the signals, has what's known as a maximum allowable speed. And that is effectively the speed limit that the engineer is allowed to operate in the segment. And so that plays a factor here. And so the speed limit, or effectively the design speed limit, will be 110 miles per hour where it is allowed. If the geometry at any particular segment does not allow it, that maximum allowed speed is reduced. And that is something that every engineer is required to know to operate on the railroad. Yeah.
Yeah. Vicky?
Yeah, so just in thinking about that and the speeds, and in the rolling stock there where it mentions freight and also speed limit mentions freight, that's going to be slower, and you have to figure that all in too, although there's fewer of them. And so that made me think back in this business plan slide where we have the moderate growth scenario. It mentions the 8 Caltrain trains and the 4 HSR trains. freight?
Excellent question. So in the business plan, that's the peak hour scenario. And so there's typically not freight operations during those peak hour operations because they are slower. And so there are some locations where there are sightings where freight trains are placed when again the peak hour is in operation. So that's in the off-peak, those headways or those frequencies are reduced.
So that sharing of the corridor is more important at peak when you have more trains and you don't have the freight then. And so when the freight's slowing it down, and you have less trains, it's not as big a deal. Is that-
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Yes.
Thank you.
And we'll have a diagram where we'll show train slots, what we call train slots. So we'll show how those trains would be slotted in the corridor.
To the chair. Nadia Naik, the ex officio. So question, does the 2-minute headway assume level boarding? Level boarding. So not all the stations have level boarding because there's step downs and step ups, and Caltrain has long had sort of a plan to try to think about that. So I'm just questioning if did we assume level boarding?
It assumes a typical dwell time, which could be level boarding. Now, when you do not have, say, a wheelchair or needing to have a special lift, that dwell time can be hit. But in this case, that's something that is being evaluated by Caltrain as to how to be able to achieve level boarding. In this case, it assumes no disruptions in this particular model. However, we have simulated that what's known as dynamic scenarios, including disruptions, to be able to understand how quickly a train could recover.
Right.
And we can share some of that information as well.
And so just so folks know, currently, we don't have level boarding. And so you may have noticed there will be times where you're on Caltrain, you'll stop at a station, looks like everybody's boarded and the train's not taken off. And it's because they have to factor in a certain amount of fudge time in case there was somebody who had a wheelchair or some other boarding issue. And that slows down the whole operation of point-to-point service because they've got to build it in because they just can't always know.
And then second question is, does it assume center platforms?
So where there are new platforms, it would assume center platforms. That is correct.
Okay, so, but across the line later when we get into the string diagrams.
So the planned, either the existing or if there's a planned new infrastructure, whatever the planned infrastructure.
Okay, so basically this is the scenario once we've baked in all the goodies that we sort of hope for the corridor.
Correct.
Okay, and then lastly, the signaling upgrade, is it a hardware upgrade, a software upgrade? And what's it called?
To be determined on what's it's called. No, it is both hardware and software to be
Okay.
able to accommodate that.
So more fiber optic cables, more, I mean, I'm just trying to think about what opportunities
Without
exist.
getting into the explicit details, it's more of the signal blocks themselves
Okay.
and being able to handle it. You could go to a fixed or dynamic block. There's many different tools that are available that has yet to be analyzed and would be analyzed as subsequent steps.
Great, thanks.
And then just one item, as Councilmember Burt mentioned, in terms of having recovery time or accommodated time in the schedule, there is 10% of that distributed across the corridor. And that's to be able to maintain on-time performance. So that's the reason why it's there. All right, I mentioned that we have a diagram with regards to train slots. It looks like spaghetti, very colorful. However, each of the lines, so I'm gonna just walk you through this. On the x-axis, both on the top and the bottom, is time. So time goes left to right. And then space or stations are on the y-axis, so from San Francisco on the upper portion to San Jose on the lower portion. And so if you follow from left to right, you can see a train go from San Jose. I'm going to follow this blue line all the way up to San Francisco. Now, if it is an express train, then it has fewer stops. So you see a blue line here and it has fewer stops. You notice it's just going through and then it dwells. It has a flat line not intended to say it's dead, but it's stopped, and before it continues on. And so that is where the stops are in these diagrams. That is the case for high-speed rail and express, and then the local. And each of these plays an important role in understanding how the service is being understood by the customer. Right. So this is the operational side. From the customer, they see a nice, easy to read schedule that shows a train departing every 15 minutes for each of these services at their designated time.
So just to emphasize, you had to model really 3 different trains:
Yes.
high-speed rail, express Caltrain, and non-express Caltrain.
Correct.
And they all have to work together.
They have to work together, and they have to maintain that 2-minute separation in that corridor. So being very specific on where those, what we call overtakes, or a passing of one train vis-a-vis a high speed or express train of a local, which is operating typically slower, not because it doesn't want to operate faster, but because it's making more frequent stops.
And so places where that horizontal bump is bigger is because you're needing to hold a train a little bit longer at a station to accommodate a passing, as opposed to just what it might take to board that station, that train.
Correct. And so we have here encircled, in this case, California Avenue was being shown as the 4-track test. You can see the local dwelling while it is waiting for a higher speed train to effectively pass it right here. So you see this little gold line right there, and then a red line is essentially splitting it in half, going right through in the middle. And it is there waiting to make sure it has its 2-minute separation before it proceeds, before it's given the green signal to proceed. And so that's it. This is this example. In this case, we did look at Millbrae, where there is a high-speed rail platform for that 4-track segment. The Hayward Park Hillsdale, where there's those 2 stations, Redwood City, and then a segment, and all 4 segments were evaluated in the city of 3 segments in the city of Palo Alto, Palo Alto Station, California Avenue, and then San Antonio Station. So those were the 3.
Edgar, why is it important to be at a station?
Excellent question. So in this case, the reason why it's so important is that imagine yourself as a customer on the train. If you are that customer that's getting ready to get off at the next station, but the 4-track is not at the station, it's just before it, you're waiting there that whole time instead of having stopped, gotten off, and then other people get to wait, albeit a little less than they would have than if the segment was not at a station. And it's just trying to make that operation and customer experience more efficient.
And put differently, having that passing and the train stopping at the station serves 2 purposes at once.
Yes.
The passing and the boarding.
And the boarding, all in that location. And that's an excellent segue. Oh, we have it as a PDF here as opposed to an animation. So I will pull back that animation. Long story short is that you have, in this case, say a local train coming into the turnout. I wish everything else was blank, but essentially they come into the turnout to go into the station. They're green here. And then they stop at the station. At this location, the moment it clears the turnout is when we start the stopwatch for 2 minutes, because the higher speed train, this red train, cannot enter that space until that 2-minute has been cleared. So that signal will be red. It will not give a proceed signal until it's met the 2 minutes. While that train is dwelling, the train gets the green light through and then able to proceed. And it takes about at minute 420 here is when this train has cleared, and this train is able to, the green train at the station is able to proceed. Again, why? Because this green train cannot proceed until it has a 2-minute gap with the higher speed train. whether it's a Caltrain or high-speed rail train. So that's a very important element. And we'll actually provide a small video to the group to be able to show the animation.
So at 4:20 is at that point, but then 2 minutes after that.
2 minutes, right? So
6:20.
6:20 is when everything has cleared this 4-track segment. And that's an important distinction.
Just a question. I mean, I obviously know what the punchline is coming,
Yeah.
but based on the spaghetti diagrams, for lack of a more technical term, it looks like the better technical crossing spot from a schedule adherence perspective would have been Palo Alto Avenue. Is that correct? Because it would have been less interference with the. I mean, I understand why it's not, and you'll get into that. But
Yeah, typically in this, the idea is that as far north as possible is almost the ideal from quote unquote operations, but it's only because you're trying to create the differential, right? You're trying to create as much runway, so to speak, for that higher speed train, whether it's express or high speed rail, to be able to go. However, that's only if you're looking at the context between San Jose and Palo Alto. We have to look at the entire corridor. So we also saw that there were benefits to having it at California Avenue operationally for the entire corridor. So, but yes, the observation of having it as far north as possible is reasonable when looking at just speed differentials. And the technical term for those who are interested is string line diagrams. In the 4-track analysis, so we start with the track charts again, the schematic track charts. This is just where we started, and then overlaid the adopted service vision. Jill had walked us through those segments. One thing I'd like to note that prior to our work proceeding in this 4-track segment analysis in North Santa Clara County, the Mountain View Transit Center was identified as a 4-track segment as part of the adopted service vision, but was removed before our work initiated. And it was due to the following. The 4-track capacity was really better supported further north. And it was not operationally preferred because it would not support those service patterns developed. As we discussed, the 4-track wanted to be as far north as possible. That was from an operational perspective. But we understand the sensitivities that service and operations are not the only parameter for identifying where the 4-track segment is. So context is important. However, like as I mentioned, this segment was removed prior to our work proceeding. That's correct. Segment D was removed. So on the screen before you are the components of the trade-offs, and I'm just going to go clockwise from service and around. So a key parameter under service is changes in schedules or overtakes versus no changes. So we did look at, can we make adjustments to where the train slots are to be able to have the overtakes occur potentially in a different location, or again, different meaning a few 100 feet or a quarter mile or a half mile different. Locations of those 4-track segments. What happens if we do adjust it thinner or shorter? What does that mean from a service resiliency? Remember, it's not just being able to have a schedule, but to have a reliable and consistent schedule throughout the corridor. The location of the 4-track segment, and again, that service resiliency, ownership. So in terms of the right-of-way, ownership of the right-of-way and the consistency of the use of the railway relative to, again, whatever's functioning, whether it's 4-track or other uses surrounding it. Between design and right-of-way, there's a trade-off between impacts to sites versus impacts to corridors vis-a-vis streets. So understanding, okay, which ones can occur or cannot occur, or the implications of those impacts. On the design side, the basis of design, does the design speed change? Is there a functional change in terms of the tracks and its assignment, the trackway itself? Then finally, train speed and turnout design. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on these two because they are very important when we talk about transitions between 2-track and 4-track. There has to be the ability for those trains to transition between tracks. And this is where we go into turnout design and service. In this case, it's really, I'm going to walk you through a few parameters here. We're getting a little bit on the technical side of rail design and turnout design. The first is the maximum allowable speed. As I mentioned, this is the ability for the train to be able to operate through a turnout. So the turnout is made up of two components. One is the through movement that's straight, and then the diverging movement, which is the angled track that comes off of it to create the pair track. So you could either design the turnout to be 79 miles per hour, turnout to be 50 miles per hour, or 60 miles per hour. The typical turnout on the Caltrain corridor is what's known as a number 20, the second table below. However, we are exploring the turnout being a larger turnout, number 24, which allows for 60 miles per hour through that divergent movement. There are larger turnouts, however, those are more complicated to construct, and we thought it was conservative to be able to start with the number 24, and if at a later time, it could be upsized if necessary. And then the transition between the platforms, depending on the different speeds, 79 miles per hour versus 110 miles per hour, and one can notice the longer distance necessary for that higher speed. And that's because they're starting at 110 miles per hour and having to then transition over. So they have to, again, physically translate horizontally. And trains don't like moving sideways. They have to be gradually transitioned to sideways. There are two types of turnouts that we looked at in our design. The first is known as a left-hand turnout. So the turnout moves the train to the left with the center platform configuration shown. The second type of turnout we did was a right-hand turnout, where the divergent train goes to the right. How and which trains is selected to go through the turnout can have implications up and down the corridor. So for example, if a higher speed train is going through in a through movement, it's able to maintain 110 miles per hour. If it is not, it must slow down to the slower speed that's allowed through the divergent movement, in this case, 60 miles per hour. So we did look at the simulation where the divergent movement was for the slower trains to be able to leverage the fact that they were going slower. They were getting ready to go into the station. A local train getting into the station is ready to slow down. It's not going to be coming in hot, so to speak. It's not coming in fast. So it is able to slow down and leverage the fact that it has to slow down to go through the divergent movement. With us, yes, please.
So I get the slower and the horizontal movement, but why is the left and right different?
So it depends on which speed is going through, or which train is going through the divergent movement. So in this case, you see that the left train, the stopping train, is going through the divergent movement. So it's slowing down in advance of the station. Therefore, it's taking advantage of the slower speed that it has to go through in this divergent movement. Versus here, a higher speed train, and that higher speed train is able to go through at 110 miles per hour. If the higher speed train has to go through the divergent movement, it has to slow down to 60 miles per hour before proceeding. And therefore, the stopping train is not taking advantage of it.
I totally get that
Uh-huh.
conceptually. I'm not tracking it in the chart though, because I thought the slower train was the top row and the faster train is the bottom row. And then we have columns with left and right. And so when I look at that, it looks like the slow train, if it's turning left, needs 1,200 feet. If it's turning right, it needs 1,800.
Excellent question. The speeds on the left are irrespective of train. They're just speeds.
Okay.
So if we were to say that at a specific location, the maximum allowable speed at the 4-track segment was 79 miles per hour, say that the geometry didn't allow for anything faster, then the transitions, yes, are shorter, But the difference between the two turnouts is still great. It's still 600 feet. Versus at 110 miles per hour, the distance are slightly longer. And yes, the difference is slightly longer, but you're able to leverage more of the speed.
Yeah, no, the relative,
Yeah.
the two rows relative to each other makes
Yeah.
sense to me. It was the left versus the right, like why it's slower to turn one way than the other. It's what it appears.
No, in this case, we could have removed 79 miles per hour for simplicity. This was just a table that we used if the geometry required 79 miles per hour. Maybe I'm not understanding the question explicitly.
Maybe I'm not asking it right, but I understand that, you know, if the through train can go straight and keep
Yeah.
its speed and it's the faster train, that's great. It goes faster. It appears to say that if one turns left, the transition length is shorter. If one turns right, the transition length is longer.
Oh,
Why is that?
Yes, it has to deal with the fact that you need to create separation. In this case, you already see the separation has occurred between the two tracks. You see the relative distance between these two. In the left-hand turnout, if the two tracks are immediately adjacent to each other, that's essentially 15 feet on center. You have to create that space. You have to transition out to then allow for the left-hand turnouts. You need to create the space for the left-hand turnouts. In the right-hand turnout, the two tracks can stay in their alignment as they stand very close to each other, and then the right-hand turnouts are just on either side of those tracks. So the transition.
So this may not be to scale in the diagram.
That is
that's what got me. Okay, I knew something was okay. Thank
Yes.
you. I get it.
Illustrative only. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? I think Metrolink uses the turnout number 24. I'm curious, does anyone use one that is designed faster for the faster speed above the 24?
Currently in operation, no.
Okay.
So that's why we're conservative with the number
Yeah.
24s.
Thank you.
Typical section for running track. In this case, we are showing the cross section that was utilized in the most constraint possible. So there are actually several cross sections that we had developed because there's typically when you have tracks, you want either a space for maintenance vehicles. So this is where it's most constrained. However, it does bow out where necessary for cabinet signals, for maintenance pads. Typically, you'd like to have just enough space for a truck to be able to drive adjacent to the tracks. So this is the most constrained example. However, we did look at, again, the basis of design across the board and applied the appropriate section depending on the available right-of-way in space. This is for a tangent for a track and not for curved. Once you go into curves, the space between the tracks needs to be slightly wider to be able to allow for those trains to be able to continue to have a larger dynamic envelope when going through a curve.
And you mentioned the need for space for or preference for space for a vehicle on the outside of the track. So is that a necessity or a preference?
It is a preferred, and it depends on the conditions of the location, whether it is a necessity. So that everything is context sensitive. Typically, yes, a railroad would want to have space for a vehicle to be able to go. The reason why is that a vehicle would have to go onto what's known as high rail to go onto the tracks. And those are specific points in which a vehicle can and cannot go onto the railway.
So high rail is when you have a maintenance vehicle that's actually running on the tracks.
On the tracks, correct.
And what's the downside of that again? There are places that you can't do that, you said?
It's because it can affect the operations of the corridor. And so you try to minimize that as much as possible.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
The technical analysis utilized all these tools. We looked at operations, cross sections, turnouts, and the alignment designs. And we applied that in different ways, and be able to understand those trade-offs, as I mentioned in the triangle, and be able to again understand the operations relative to the physical space and vice versa. And so we applied this all together, and we frankly applied it to the segments. So let's jump into that and what we've observed. And we start with some very illustrative diagrams, and then we'll jump into some more of the constraints that we observed and analyzed. In the Palo Alto station segment, sort of the key takeaway was high community and infrastructure impacts. So just to orient the group, we have that track chart that we had earlier, and then highlighting the segments that were analyzed, and then the segment characteristics. In this case, it's the milepost where it starts and ends, the length of it, the stations, and any grade separations or active projects, or at grade crossings or grade separated crossings and active projects. In this case, this was the Palo Alto station segment, which we had looked at from Palo Alto Avenue to Churchill Avenue. And now this is an important distinction, and this is something that was important as an assumption of ours, is we worked as much as possible to try to avoid grade crossings, or to be able to allow for the transitions to occur either at or outside of those grade crossings, again, to be able to be a good partner in terms of the ability to be able to for future grade separations. So that was an assumption that we worked towards as much as possible. And so in this case, it was from Palo Alto Avenue to Churchill Avenue. In this segment, there were some key constraints that we wanted to be cognizant of. And here's the reason why we also avoided Palo Alto Avenue as a crossing. Well, there's the San Francisco Creek Bridge and the El Palo Alto tree. So we said, let's avoid that for now. And that assumption could be questioned at a later time, but that was at least our starting point. El Camino Park, the softball field there that's adjacent to the railway. The Palo Alto Southern Pacific Station, it's a historic resource and designated as such. And so that's an important component there. The Alma Street and University Avenue interchange, so both the bridge and those interchange components towards Stanford University and to downtown Palo Alto. And then Sutter Health Center towards the right, being able to understand, again, some key community assets and resources.
And one other thing that this picture shows is that, contrary to our intuition, the tracks running through the University Avenue area are not straight. That's a legacy from 100 years ago when the University Avenue underpass was built, and so they have a dog leg there.
Yes, again, great.
Huh?
Is it severe?
Well, not severe. You can see it visually.
Yeah, so you can see this offset here.
But it matters.
Yes.
It's built on the shoe fly.
Yeah. Yeah, they kept the shoe fly track. They built a shoe fly track, and it stayed there for 100 years.
Yeah. So so yes, it does matter, because as I mentioned, moving trains horizontally is not easy. And the faster the train goes, the harder it is to translate or shift that train over. So when we think of higher speeds, when I say if you're moving a track, the higher the speed, the more gradual it needs to be. Because again, those wheels do not turn. They have to follow the rail.
Go for it.
So irrespective of the for tracking, does that dog leg necessarily is it going to necessarily slow down the high-speed rail when it comes through there?
In this case,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
A question. So you mentioned the softball fields. What's the significance of this? Does it encroach upon their right of way, or is it just?
We would just, anything that's a community asset, we were just trying to be aware of that. So in this case, a softball field or a park.
Okay.
Well, and this goes into both this alternative and then the next one south. Each of those actually encroach on dedicated parkland, which under our city charter has to go to a vote of the people to undedicate unless it's really de minimis. And we'll need to understand whether the Caltrain as another government agency can supersede that, or we would have to go to our voters.
as part of this analysis is mostly to identify those constraints
Yeah.
and be able to understand the trade-offs. So in this case, this is a one location that's a constraint. So if the not just the concept, but when this is implemented in the future, be able to understand that trade-off, that if the park cannot be impacted, what does that translate to as to other impacts? And just beginning to identify that and start understanding those trade-offs today. And so with the Palo Alto station segment, we do have a hand up. Do we want the, oh, sorry. Oh, gotcha. Thank you. And so in this case, we did look at just, again, footprint to be able to understand those trade-offs, be able to see where does that fit, how do transitions occur when you do have curves, and just be able to understand those outside limits, and be able to, again, start seeing, in this case, you can see how far it potentially encroaches onto the University Avenue Alma Street interchange, and how that could be reconfigured if necessary. And so that was just, again, highlighting the extents of horizontally of a 4-track segment at the Palo Alto Station segment.
Does it ever? Yeah, right. Sorry. In this section, in this modeling, does it ever touch housing that would have to be removed?
In this case, it did not touch housing.
Okay, thanks.
Correct.
But it's way wider than the current, overpass. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it is. And that's to be able to accommodate the station and the 4-track through this segment.
Also,
Sorry, and also to note, it looks like it, apart from going right up against Alma in the places where it doesn't go on over Alma, it looks like it goes right into the Sutter Health, I believe that's Sutter Health Center on the bottom right.
And again, a clarification here, it's illustrative, but it's influence area, right? It's not the exact extents. Yes, the tracks can shift and the design can shift. This is, again, to be able to identify the key constraints and the key trade-offs. Now, at the Palo Alto Station, there are some infrastructure challenges, constraints, and that is, again, as Councilmember or Chair Burt mentioned, this is a very well-patroned station in the corridor, both from rail and bus operations, and so this is again, the bus station as well as the transit center to the left or to the north. But it's that infrastructure plus the interchange to the east that is critical. So that would mean modification to roadways, et cetera. For the California Avenue segment, limited, I would say, less community and infrastructure impacts relative to the Palo Alto segment. In this case, it's the same information on the left in the table. In this case, we did look at Churchill Avenue to East Meadow Drive, and being able to, again, identify the ability to be able to stay within the extents as much as possible from those at-grade crossings.
But is it correct that it's not inclusive of Churchill, it's immediately south of Churchill?
Correct. Our intention was to stay outside as much as possible of those at-grade crossings. And in this case, because of the distance being further or longer, I should say, between Churchill and East Meadow Drive, we're able to have those transitions occur inside those grade separation or those grade crossings. In this location, there are two key assets or constraints that we had identified. In fact, there should be there's a third that we'll flag here in a moment. Oregon Expressway interchange. I'm going to go right to left. Oregon Expressway is a key asset, infrastructure asset adjacent to the station, and we'll highlight as to why that's important. Alexander Pierce Park to the north, and then there are homes and there is a community adjacent to the railway to the north. In this segment, we show the influence area of this 4-track. So you see the transition from 2. You see a little bit thinner here, 2 to 4-track. And we do see that the influence area is going into Alma Street and adjacent properties. And the intention here is to understand those trade-offs again, to be able to see how those constraints and trade-offs can play out if 4-track were to be further evaluated as implemented, pardon me, on California Avenue segment. And to, again, understand those constraints, understand those challenges. And then at the station, as you can see, it is a wider footprint, similar to a Palo Alto station, wider footprint, and that can have an influence on the Oregon Expressway infrastructure. And in this case, we do see that there may be, or likely, I should say, infrastructure modifications to the Oregon Expressway interchange in order to be able to accommodate that 4-track at the California Avenue station. There's a recurring theme that you'll hear is that infrastructure does get influenced or impacted by 4-track, and you'll see the same at San Antonio segment. In the yes, please.
So you talked about some of the benefits of having the longer 4-track, but obviously there's trade-offs, especially going through a residential neighborhood. Is there, I mean, could you have option B be shorter?
There was that option explored. The challenge is then the overtakes. The shorter the overtake, the longer the dwell is at the station in this case. And so that would mean a longer dwell time. Already, as part of the analysis, the typical dwell time is 1 minute, sorry. We're already going to observe a 4-minute dwell time at this California Avenue station, or at a station that's in North Santa Clara County.
So even with that length of the 4-track, the dwell time would be 4 minutes.
Correct.
So if it were shortened, it would be longer. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. But in a sense, and not to overly complicate things, we have these remaining options A, B, C, but arguably they could even be tweaked somehow.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, this is I would say this is the identification, the due
Exemplary.
diligence. Yeah, this is the due diligence to understand what those constraints are, in which case the tracks could be translated west, they could be translated east. And keep in mind that I made a caveat earlier that we didn't look at explicitly profiles, so the tracks could be elevated onto a viaduct, in which case that can allow for even more horizontal translation if necessary. And so this is just to identify the initial sort of influence area, and then allow for subsequent steps to then understand, okay, how does that get further refined as you allow for profile adjustments?
Thank you. That's helpful.
Is it fair to say also though, so this work was done as a result of Palo Alto trying to move its alternatives forward and trying to understand how alternatives could be impacted.
Yes.
But as continued analysis of other alternatives and other segments happens, there's a possibility that there could be more work done in this. As an example, we haven't talked about in Palo Alto about Palo Alto Avenue or the station area or any of the stuff that's happening in the north. And if there was some significant change that could potentially impact, I'm not saying it would, but for right now, the main case of this is that it's not that a 4-track or a 4-track elevated is being built. It's what you looked at is how this might constrain any alternatives that we are currently doing design work on. Is that
Correct. It's
Okay.
looking back again at that PMFA language that Caltrain cannot take an action that precludes or materially makes more complicated the implementation of high-speed rail service. The San Antonio station segment. So this is the third segment in the North Santa Clara County or the city of Palo Alto that we analyzed. This one does have high community infrastructure impacts and major reconstruction of infrastructure if it were to be selected. And so in this case, I'm just going to jump to it in terms of the footprint and the constraints. In this case, you can see that horizontal alignment of 4-track and a station going essentially beyond the station and onto Alma Street. And in this case, this was to avoid Showers Drive and to be able to avoid the property to the north as well, and to see, okay, how can this be implemented? And you'll notice that it goes right over or along the space where there's overhead ramps. Let's show the constraint, but let's show the images that are much more effective at communicating it than I. This is really important here. So you see the 2 tracks and the station, and right behind the station, you see these columns. Those columns are, again, designed to be able to support not only the overpass, but the ramps off of that overpass onto Alma Street. And in this case, and go to the next image, you see that that column goes through the station platform. So if you were to place another track next to this track, it's plowing through that column. If you were to move the tracks to be able to, say, put a center platform station here, then those tracks are going through multiple sets of columns. And so you can see, again, that impact of the 4-track configuration on the infrastructure. But I believe this image in particular is quite poignant in conveying that. So what that would mean in terms of 4-track configuration, that if the tracks were to be constructed at grade, it would mean a complete reconstruction of the interchange to be able to accommodate that. Now, the question could be, well, could you, modify the bridge to be able to accommodate 4-track? One thing that I'm always reminded by our structural engineers is that once you touch a structure, you have to bring it up to code. And so that means you're looking at more than just a segment, you're looking at the entire structure at that point. And it's as you can see in this aerial, it's a very large influence of that structure. So in summary of these 3 segments, really there are constraints in all 3. That's the reality. They all have different sort of varying levels of constraints. However, this was, again, to be able to identify these constraints and understand the trade-offs. And so this is just that summary of those constraints. And the good thing of this work, of this homework that we had done at the request of the city of Palo Alto, is that it validated those 4-track segments within the adopted service vision. It was analyzed through simulations to be able to understand those limits and be able to confirm those mileposts. Again, it did assume that 2-minute buffer between trains versus 4 minutes, an important assumption. It requires infrastructure to be able to achieve that across the corridor. And it supports and provides that operational flexibility. In what we looked at was not just, again, the locations, but the ability to be able to maintain the high level of on-time performance that is expected of a railway. And in this case, a station at a 4-track segment will have a dwell time of 4 minutes, which is 3 more than the standard 1-minute dwell. And one thing to note is that Caltrain is going to continue to coordinate with the city so as to not preclude 4-track within the alternatives that the city has identified as part of connecting Palo Alto. With that, concludes our presentation.
Thank you. Let's go to members of the public before we go to any other questions or comments.
Chair, we have one request to speak. Just give me 1 moment. Okay, our first speaker is Eric Nordman.
Go ahead, Eric.
Hello, this is Eric Nordman. I had 2 questions. So when when existing overpasses our grade separations are upgraded to 401, will the existing overpass in general have to be upgraded to withstand that extra weight? And then the second question had to do with for the city of Palo Alto is since this sort of implies that a 4-track will have a significant width to it, does this allow us to eliminate in the trench option? And that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And before hitting any questions from the committee, if you have answers to Mr. Nordman's questions, that'd be great.
So the bridges do need to be modified to be able to have 4-track where it's necessary. And yes, those bridges may need to be upsized if necessary to be able to accommodate the load. And that's to be able to handle both Caltrain and UP service in the corridor. And the second question was the trench.
Oh, what impacts would this have on the potential to do a trench alternative?
So in this case, it is a much wider facility. It would have to, again, be able to not only accommodate the width, but also those transitions, both the 2 to 4-track and the vertical transitions down. What it means in terms of be able to proceed with that alternative is for the city to.
Well, and is there also an issue of how would you go from having built a 2-track trench to a 4-track trench? Would you have to build it for 4-track from the outset, even if we may never have 4-track because we may never have high-speed rail?
Well, the feasibility of being able to stage a 2 to 4-track transition or construction would be extraordinarily challenging to do. The reason why is because you need to be able to have the space to not what's called foul the track or protect the railway. And so when you have that condition of a wall adjacent to a track, you're building you're trying to widen those walls out. And that becomes very challenging to be able to excavate, especially with an electrified corridor. That becomes another.
So does that mean that in all likelihood, if a trench were considered, it would have to be constructed at the outset with a 4-track capacity?
It couldn't preclude, correct, that 4-track.
Yeah. So you'd have to basically build a trench big enough for 4 tracks, even if the potential for 4 tracks may or may not happen in the future.
That's to be able to be consistent with that PMFA, that commitment from Caltrain.
Got it.
And also to note the creek issues, which would, exacerbate that. So yeah, that I think that it would be a trench would more likely need to construct for the 4 tracks initially. Otherwise, it would be extremely difficult to navigate the creek issues and to be able to realign the tracks.
Sounds right.
I wanted to also add additionally, I think these are questions. Caltrain hasn't had the opportunity to review the trench alternative as we have other alternatives through the preliminary review process. And so that would be a question for the city, right? Is that something that we want to do further analysis on? And so I think to the public commenters' point as well, Caltrain has very preliminary analysis and understanding of what that impact is, but it would have to be something that's done through the design. That's, something that we've taken on with the service agreement with the city. So I would just keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, it's a good point and something the committee may want to look at taking up maybe at our next meeting, which is based on this new information. Do we want to have that analysis done so that we can be clear one way or another whether a trench is viable or what much greater cost impact it might have even than what we were considering for a 2-track trench? Vicky?
Just on that narrow point, would that analysis be, in addition to the technical would there also be some legal analysis there? Because what I appreciate your question about, do we have to build it out for 4, or do we just have to preserve the ability to, even if it's extraordinarily expensive and blah blah blah, like, right?
It's my understanding is that technically we would only have to allow for it. Practically, it's almost impossible to build a 2-track trench and then a 4.
Yeah, and I think that part of this is also going back to kind of what I started with, which is this is the homework, right, of where operational feasibility kicks in on where this 4-track is necessary based upon the blended service needs for both high-speed rail and Caltrain. And I think that this can help influence a lot of the work that, you know, we've been partnering with city staff on and evaluating now, okay, based upon this knowledge, how do we apply it to these alternatives, right? And so ensuring that, again, through the review process, we can take into consideration, well, is this the best opportunity? Because to Chair Burt's point, it's about, you know, implement or what's implementable for a 4-track versus what's constructible later.
I just want to say, I thought Edgar summarized it really well, because the way I think it's written in the RCUP is it can't preclude, but also make materially more expensive. And that's the key. So even if you could build it, if you're going to make it so much more expensive, if they have to come near the thing afterwards, then it wouldn't be okay. And then to Edgar's technical point, if you're too close to the existing trench, when you try to expand the trench, it makes it so you can't construct it, because things can fall into the existing hole and it wouldn't work. So, I mean, based on the mile markers and my remembering the trench alternative, it starts right after Matadero Creek, if not slightly before, which means that at that point, you're talking about a width of already for 4 tracks. And I mean, certainly if we agendize this for a future meeting, we should talk about it, but I'm not sure it's worth doing. I mean, it's pretty obvious. You don't really have to do a lot of math to see that it won't fit.
Well, and this issue of who material the more expensive to whom, and that brings up the clarification that is it correct that if and when a 4-track is actually needed, that those funds wouldn't be the burden on the city to build those additional tracks. That would be on the railway system, high-speed rail, Caltrain, some combination of it. But that we can't select an alternative that would be materially more expensive or than other alternatives. Is that correct? That it's this, if and when the 4-track happens, that's not a city responsibility to construct that, correct?
So I think that's something that we've explored and talked about as a project team. And I think although we're on the right track, right? I think I would just want to make sure we do that confirmation and huddling up with our partner agency in order to ensure that we have the right direction on what that future constructability would look like and whose responsibility it would be.
Well, and say we built whatever we're going to do for 2 tracks. If 15 years from now, there's a need for 4 tracks, it's not the city who's coming and saying we need 4 tracks. And I don't see any way that's the city's financial liability to do that.
I definitely hear you, Chair Burr, and I think that that's definitely something that from an agency perspective, and again, with our partners, High Speed Rail, it's something we would have to explore.
Okay, Ed?
Yeah, that's starting to get into my 2-part question. First, is there any update on the potential timeline, or as Chair Burt said, if and when we do a 4-track, as to when you're going to make that decision?
So we can definitely begin to have the conversations about what the responsibility of funding looks like in the near future. But I think that in terms of, and if I understand your question correctly, Council Member Lowing, in terms of timing of when high-speed rail will come, I think where the date itself is still set out in the future, I think 2032, 33. That's the earliest. And so I will leave that there because that's the most, recent and up-to-date timeline marker that we have. Although that again is up to the planning efforts from High Speed Rail, which Caltrain does not dictate in terms of when they would arrive.
Just put it in terms of a funding concept. They have in the neighborhood of $20 billion that has been identified. And as of right now, the estimate of the system is about 120 billion, but that's before they do some cost updates for things like a massive tunnel through Pacheco. So we can all do our own speculation on the feasibility of that, but
Right, which means there is the option that it doesn't get done. No question about
yeah,
that.
there's
So obviously what I'm trying to kind of get our arms around here is what can we do? Because we can't wait 50 years to decide to build 2 or 4 tracks. So that we have to get some direction on that, and connected with it, just to put the other part of my question on the table is kind of what we started here, based on the good work we saw tonight. Should we indeed try to eliminate some of the alternatives because we don't want all that infrastructure disrupted to do 4-track. And if we're not going to know that for decades, then we have to make that decision without that answer. And so then we have to negotiate which ones we don't want you to do and work on, whatever it is.
the dilemma is that whether we think high-speed rail is coming or not, we and Caltrain have to do grade separations in ways that allow for 4 tracks in a given location.
Yeah. So that's why I just wanted to review the timeline for the record and for the public. And now I'm backing into when can we have a negotiation if we want one to say, of these 4 that you showed that are all problematic, we really don't want you to go here because of X, Y, and Z in terms of our infrastructure. It seems like we could start that pretty soon.
Just as a reminder, you still have the rest of public comment.
We have an additional speaker? Did I miss it altogether?
2 more.
Oh, my apology to the speakers. I thought we only had one. Why don't we go ahead and take the other public speakers and then return to that question? Sorry about that.
Our next speaker is Steve Rosenblum.
Yeah, thanks so much for this really interesting discussion. This issue of 4 tracks has been something that we've been waiting to hear about for 10 years now. So I'm glad to see that we're finally getting some feedback. I had a question which is only been lightly touched on, maybe easy to answer, is were there any compromises necessary to deal with freight on the right of way? And also, does Caltrain have any idea how long freight service will be required on the right of way? Right now, there's only 2 or 3 trains a day, and I don't know that how important that is to the future. Could we get any feedback from the Caltrain representatives on that issue? Thanks.
Let's go ahead and have the other public commenter, and then we'll go to see if we can address any of their questions.
Our next commenter is Adrian Brandt.
Yeah, sorry for not raising my hand sooner. So, yeah, I just wanted to make a couple comments. In the presentation, it was mentioned that to be nice that the grade crossings were being avoided. But I would point out that CPUC, to my knowledge, at least in Redwood City, this is the case. They will not allow new crossings or cross tracks to be added to existing crossings, but new crossings with more than 2 tracks. So it effectively in Redwood City, I know, requires that, everywhere we want a 4-track around our planned downtown station, that we must grade separate the 2 tracks on either side of the 4-track section. Also, regarding the switch numbers and the turnout speeds discussed in the presentation, it's very common to have what's known as moving frog turnouts. They're a little more exotic, but they're in wide use in Europe, and I'm guessing probably in the East Coast where Brightline runs, or the Northeast Corridor, but they allow speeds greatly in excess of 60 miles an hour for the diverging route. I agree with Councilman Vinker that chart was very confusing, and I had a lot of difficulty with what it was trying to convey myself. So I would suggest maybe improving the clarity of that one chart that was showing the different the merging distances. And then lastly, on the subject of a viaduct was briefly touched on. A viaduct is probably the most easy to expand, except for at San Antonio Road, where there's already something up in the air. But in some ways, that's an insurance policy against this requirement to not preclude expanding to 4 tracks, because adding additional width to a viaduct, with a parallel viaduct for new tracks, if that should ever be required in the future, is probably the easiest design to accommodate that. And so in some ways, that's an insurance policy where Palo Alto could have the freedom to not worry about precluding, running afoul of that particular requirement. So just wanted to throw that out there. But that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. And that does conclude it. Okay. So if Caltrain folks have any clarifications for questions raised by those public commenters, that would be welcome.
Yeah, the first question with regards to compromising the design to deal with freight, no, there was no specific compromises of the design to deal with the freight. And so that answers the first.
And then I think to clarify on the second, at this time, Caltrain is planning for freight being a part of our system. And that's we are always going to accommodate for freight service. And so that's where we're at right now as an agency.
And then picking up where we left off on Ed's question. Go ahead.
Yes, I did not forget that. So we have to accommodate high-speed rail and Caltrain service regardless of when high-speed rail comes. And I think that, again, we did this analysis to provide that insight on where the segment would be and really refinement of that 4-track segment. And we're committed to working with the city to accommodate and really not to preclude the 4-track and the city's design efforts for their LPAs. And so we continue to welcome feedback on the options throughout the service agreement process. And I think that this is part of the work that was, really voiced to us from the city as a concern of, we need to know where this segment is so that Councilmember Lowing, we can begin to start to have a discussion more openly and candidly about, okay, now how do we apply this to our LPAs or the city's LPAs? I said ours, but committed to the cause here. But I think to the city's LPAs to move and advance this forward.
Yeah, so I mean, it's what I'm saying, to state it another way, is that if we look at these 4, which we know a lot more about right now than we did an hour ago, and we say, oh, it's real clear to us that we can't redo the whole San Antonio infrastructure, so we want that off. Is that something we can negotiate now, or do you just want a prioritization of 1 through 4 in terms of our preferences?
Let me add one other big wrinkle to this, which is, as Rippon mentioned, our staff has just received the technical feedback on the various alternatives that we've been looking at, and that feedback provides even more considerations that influence the decision making. So I think we are going to want to soon merge these additional considerations of what are the 4-track impacts and what are all the other technical impacts, and see how that influences either making one of the alternatives or more less favorable or another comparatively more favorable. When we do that, I think at the end of the meeting, as we get into our discussions on upcoming meetings, that's going to be real crucial, because as we discussed in the last meeting, we've got some aggressive timelines for narrowing our alternatives because of the grant funding that we had. And we're going to have to merge all this new information, make recommendations to council, and then get it to the council and see if we can have additional refinement on preferred alternatives.
The reason I picked the San Antonio as an example in my question is because I don't think it's obvious. For example, we may want to do a major infrastructure change there, given that's a targeted housing site for the next 8 years. So that puts the onus back on us to figure out when it comes to the right time to say, here's our preferences. So
Well,
it's another wrinkle.
and-
It's another wrinkle I'm putting on the table.
Well, and that's an expressway and a county VTA
Right.
Owned project. And to my knowledge, they haven't been brought into this on this with this latest information. Is VTA up to speed on this at all?
I had a very light touch conversation with VTA actually this afternoon. However, we are looking to share this information with them very, very soon.
Yeah, and then we have at VTA, we have the grade separation ad hoc committee, and it's a question whether we'd want to have any presentation there, although this is principally, well, that would affect Mountain View as well if it was considered it. The expressways on the border of the two cities. So we've got a number of new factors, and we would need to have VTA into that conversation if we were going to better understand whether reconstruction of San Antonio is even an option. Yeah, Vicky.
Thank you. I'd like to further complicate this. No, first of all, though, thank you for the presentation. Actually, it was tremendously helpful. And I actually really love the spaghetti chart that she's calling it. That was really helpful to me in seeing that the lines go through. And I want to thank Mr. Brandt for having my back on the one that I had trouble understanding. The thing that we haven't really talked about, because it's probably too multivariate to talk about very easily, but it's critical to all this, is cost, right? So we kind of have, I don't know, 9 scenarios or something. We have the 3 locations of the 4 potential for tracking. We have the different LPAs. I know that it would be a lot of work, and I'm not suggesting we get a number for each of those, but I wonder if some relative, this would be more than that, would be more than the other, might be helpful when we do the coalescing of the 2 that Chair Burt suggested. So see, I am making it more complicated, but I think that's something we can't forget, because when I listen to, for example, the 4-track trench, that sounds wildly expensive to me as well. And I don't know, that's a guess, but I think things like that, were we to prepare this for our full council, are things that we also should be trying to sort out.
Well, that's a good point. And we've used AECOM to date to do the cost estimates of alternatives. It does bring up a question whether we need them to begin work sooner rather than later on the very rough order of magnitude cost implications, as opposed to anything that attempts to be at all refined. Because we may all intuitively say, gee, it's a bunch more dollars, but what is a bunch? And they need some time. And if we look at the timeline of how do we get to a decision and a recommendation to go to council, we'd have to have some of that input by the time we get to council.
Can I just say, we actually have costing data for all of the alternatives.
Including 4-track?
Not
That's what I
including
mean.
4-track, but even just a basic review of the existing data on just the 2-track, it gives you a pretty good indication of just how much more
Well,
the ballpark would be.
Yeah, but the cost increase for one alternative from going to 4-track may be a higher proportionate increase than another alternative.
Well, the other thing that's a good reference point is actually the tunnel. So when we looked at the tunnel configuration, it's wider and it required taking lanes of Alma and bringing, drill sideways. And so the distance between the cost of the difference between the cost of the trench and the cost of the tunnel, it's somewhere in there. And if you want to narrow that further, you could go through the calculus, but I mean, I'd be hesitant to give them too much more work because they'd have to do a lot of
Ye-
designing.
well,
Yeah,
to
so,
figure out-
so
That's
to that point, so yeah, first of all, we don't have, open scope to do this. We would need a new agreement, new contract, or contract amendment. It would need to go to council. But to Nadia's point, it would be significant work, for the consultant. They would need to actually design the alternatives, as 4-tracks in order to do the cost estimates.
Well, can you meet with AECom between now and the next meeting to get a little better understanding of how much time they would need and about how much it would cost? Because then we have to make a decision on whether we're going to say we need that input to make a good decision, or we can kind of do our own extrapolation based upon the costs of the alternatives that we had on 2-track systems.
So, yes, I can likely meet with them before the next meeting, but I probably won't have any new information, just noting that our next meeting is 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, if they can, if even an approximation of how long, and maybe you have a ballpark of how much it would cost, not to do the work, but just kind of the scoping of the length of time and rough cost estimate, that would at least, if they say we need 3 months or something like that, then we're going to go, well, we've got to get to this council before then.
Yeah, I think just I'm just want to reiterate, I'm not sure that in the next 2 weeks we'll be able to get a real
Nothing
in-depth
ventured,
response.
nothing gained.
Yeah, but I certainly will attempt. And then also just noting that, of course, the devil will be in the details. Like how in depth do we want them to go on that? And that might be part of the discussion we need to have.
Yeah, I fear that if they can't even give us a sense on whether we want to go forward with them, based on how long and how much it would cost until January, and then it would take months after that to do the work, that kind of answers the question. And then we're faced with making a decision based upon extrapolation, which maybe is good enough, maybe not.
Yeah, and I guess that's why I brought up maybe not precisely costing it, but trying to get some relative sense, because there, and I understand that's where I think where you're going with the extrapolation. But when I see things like the San Antonio one in particular, where it seems like a whole new thing that's beyond, just going from 2 to 4 because we have all those undergirders and things. Can we explore if there's even just a ballparking, like it would be in excess
Well,
of X?
on the San Antonio, I suspect the better route would be to try to get a rough estimate from VTA, and I can pursue that. I know those guys. Yeah, yeah. So I can at least discuss that with our CEO and see what that would entail.
Yeah.
The other stuff, they're not going to be in the middle of.
Has there been any consideration from the city's perspective about doing a coordinated area plan with Mountain View about San Antonio just generally based on our housing element? Because it seems to me, from Mountain View's perspective, this is a new grade crossing that's already separated that they weren't even thinking about. And you would now be approaching them with this concept of like, hey, we might want to rebuild San Antonio, right? And if you were having an open discussion about what is the best way to rebuild San Antonio, given the amount of housing that both Mountain View and Palo Alto have put in and are contemplating, you may not end up with the answer of an overpass the way it is today. You might decide that you could do an underpass, an example, like they're looking at Rengstorff, and you could get back the land that is in the giant clover leaves that you had. So it's not just to add more complexity to it. I think just what this end of the table is doing that today. So I mean, if that's really a conversation that we're having, then I would, thinking with my Palo Alto only hat on, there is an inherent advantage to the station that gets 4 tracks, because you're going to get new center platforms. You're going to get some level of investment that makes you sexier from an investment perspective. And I will just reiterate, that we have not ever had our downtown coordinated area plan conversation for University Avenue, which already still has money from Measure A, which has already been a coordinated effort for which we're looking at intense housing from the Stanford conversation. So there's a lot of really interesting discussions. And then it becomes from the Palo Alto perspective only, if you were going to throw money at a station and you had to do some big rebuilding, would you rebuild San Antonio, which isn't even ours and isn't even Mountain View's main station? Or would you think about what are all the complexities of Palo Alto Avenue? And then considering operationally for Caltrain and the curve that happens in the tracks, which by the way, would be a good high-speed rail, would be super happy if you fix that curve for them. So it's not, I'm not saying that any of this is easy or big. I mean, these are really awful hard conversations. But frankly, when we started doing XCAP way back when, this was part of the reason we said we have to look at every grade separation that we have, both existing and not existing, because if you look at them in isolation and you start to work on them, you find out very quickly that the impacts of one impact the other one, and you have to look at the system. And so I feel like we're having kind of this circuitous conversation. But I just wanted to throw that out there as
I would just add one thing. We don't necessarily have money from Measure A. There's although in discussions with VTA leadership, there's a belief that a study of Measure A would be very eligible for even an FTA grant. That's not the construction part. That's just the millions of dollars for the study. Okay. I think that's where I've got to follow up with VTA, and Philip's going to check with AECOM and see if either of those have any chance of giving us any better information before we have to tackle recommendations. Okay. We good with that item? All right. So now we can move on to.
Thank you very much.
Oh, well, the next item is discussion of the metrics for prioritizing grade separations. So, and that's what it is. Item number 2 is provide update from Caltrain's policymakers group meeting regarding, well, that's the upcoming meeting next week in Mountain View, and we'll want to make sure everybody's aware of that. An important workshop meeting that is, just make sure, 4 to 6 on the Thursday, the 30th, at Mountain View City Hall. And so what we're looking at today is kind of the same topic that will be in that workshop. Is Caltrain has proposed metrics for prioritizing grade crossings. And we wanted to review those metrics and provide any feedback that we might have at this time, or at least understand it well enough so that we can subsequently provide feedback. And on that note, who would like to kick that off? Philip or Jim?
Well, yeah, I'll be happy to kick that off. Actually, I think you just described the key aspects of it pretty well. Just noting that, you know, there was one slide specifically that identified the proposed metrics, and those 4 metrics are safe and equitable mobility, equitable community benefits, cost efficiencies and reliable funding, and maximize rail corridor utility. And so with that, I think that, you know, the purpose of this item is really, as Chair Burt described, it's really to determine if there's any feedback that we want to, you know, as the city, as the rail committee, want to provide on this for Caltrain's consideration. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And we have the staff here that worked on this, so I believe they potentially can enlighten us a little more.
Sure thing. So just more kind of context is that, you know, earlier on in the corridor crossing strategy study, we worked with LPMG and CSCG to develop overall kind of program goals, right? And those are the 4 program goals that Philip outlined. And then
that's 2 acronyms.
Oh, sorry, no acronyms allowed.
Well,
Thank you.
that's all right. You can use them, but just we want
The local
at the outset.
I know, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. The local policymakers group, which Councilmember Burt, you lead and chair that group. And the CSCG is the City Staff Coordinating Group, which are the staff of all the 21 jurisdictions. And so thanks for that. So in advance, so earlier on in the study, we worked with both groups to really develop the overall program goals. And so now we've come back to the goals and have worked over the last 2 months to develop an approach to start assessing crossings. And that's been at the request of many of the jurisdictions along the corridor, really to prioritize which projects, given the significant amount of costs these projects are and the limited amount of funding. And so a big theme that we've been working on is, really there needs to be a coalition and a kind of a focus to focus on high priority projects as a region, because we've heard from FRA and US DOT how important it is to communicate the railroad's priorities. And so this is an effort to start going towards that direction. And so this initial assessment is a way to a way through evaluating each crossing with really binary metrics, right? Yes or no. Does it meet this threshold or not? And so that's the start of this discussion. And the way we framed it is that this is, we welcome the feedback. We're going to be talking with the LP&G about this on Thursday, but we also understand that there's many other additional categories that would be needed to assess, including the funding landscape, constructability, overall corridor-wide mobility. And so there's other aspects to this, certainly, that are part of the conversation. So I think hopefully that provides enough context to get the discussion going.
Okay, should we hear from members of the public first?
We have no requests to speak.
Okay. And, I had a version of this that had notes and I don't have those in front of me. Oh, you said this one.
No, same pocket.
Presto. Okay. First, anybody else have any initial questions? Vicky?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the downtime growth for the this is for the first factor, the safe and equitable mobility factor, and the gate downtime growth over 75%. Could you explain that a little bit? Is that a factor of if it hits, if the downtime is increased by more than 75%, it's a problem, or and is that, and is that okay? And when this may or may not be a factor, but are we assuming sort of a stability in the number of trains that are running? And if you can just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So this was a calculation based on the business plan. So the 2040 business plan assumed certain levels of service, and so we've taken that information from the business plan in terms of growth of that gate downtime by 75%. So that's calculation based on the business plan's work.
Okay, and what I don't know, but I think the chair does, is whether or not what that looks like post-pandemic, if there's change in service levels and demand and all of that, because I understand there might be, and that, so I'd like to understand that too.
The answer is nobody does know yet. Caltrain is looking at doing an update, I believe, looking at evaluating the business plan based on those changes in circumstances of really two fundamental changes. One is the work pattern. I'll say three. Got the work pattern, and to what extent will hybrid work be permanent? We already had incorporated the favorable impact on ridership of electrification and perhaps someday the extension to the San Francisco terminal, the DTX, on really making the system more valuable and a greater ridership. And then the revised projections for long-term population growth from Caltrans and Department of Finance, which basically So statewide, no population growth. Bay Area, only modest population growth decline in Southern California. And so that could affect the future projections, but we don't know yet. And so that's another part of the whole dilemma of looking at grade separations. We just don't know to what extent that modifies either the urgency or the number of grade separations that are needed. It's a problem because we still need to be moving forward based on certain assumptions.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That was exactly my concern, was whether we knew enough to really know to assess that particular factor. So, all right, thank you.
So
I had a
Chair,
Yeah.
if I may, just want to note that we have brought up the exhibit on the screen, so in case if that's helpful for everyone, thanks.
I was just going to ask or suggest it might be helpful, especially at the staff to staff level, to give kind of the exact language that you're thinking about, because this is obviously just a graphic to make it easier, but that would be helpful. And then second is I'm familiar with the gate down time presentations, but I think it's definitely makes sense from the Caltrain perspective. I think what it misses from the city perspective is that if you have two grade separations like Meadow and Charleston that are close enough to each other, that gate down time multiplies because the distance between them is less than a mile. And so when you impact one, you're impacting both, and that impacts the road network differently. So to the extent that we can get some kind of metrics around that, that would be super helpful. And I just wanted to say kudos, because any kind of data that's easy to get and tangible makes it easier to be able to rate these things, as we know from our own city criteria, which is amorphous and has no real numbers. And so kudos for trying to put some real numbers around this, but I think that the road impacts and the network impacts to traffic are a big deal.
I appreciate that feedback, and that's something we talked with the city staff group about. And we're in terms of thinking about corridor lens mobility. So we got some feedback in that direction as well last week, and we're thinking through how to incorporate that. Because again, these metrics are really crossing by crossing.
And so on that note, I think the number of people crossing, like literally the number of motorized vehicles, the number of bikes and peds, I know that that's something that our favorite Weebups thing or whatever already counts, but adding those metrics in, I think particularly for electeds to appreciate, just like, okay, where is all this movement coming, I think is helpful. I think also the distance to the closest grade separation really matters, right? Because there are segments where we have very big breaks, and what does that mean? And then something that came up in our city is emergency vehicle access. So you might want to think about how to put a number to that.
That's great. Appreciate that.
Well, and putting numbers to it, I think this goes to the challenge of really a desire to have kind of binary decisions, but I'm not sure that it works. So for instance, we have a category that's recent fatal rail incident and or fatal or severe crash. And certainly that's a very high value metric. But within that, there's also other, that's really the biggest part of a safety consideration. And another part of that might be, is this a location that is a priority emergency vehicle crossing? That's not as, I wouldn't assume that that's as high of a factor in safety as the one you list, but maybe we want the category to be safety, with this as the primary consideration and then secondary considerations. And then as Nadia was kind of talking about, we say gate downtime growth over 75%. And it's really, I think the issue is the impact on gate downtime where it's a significant congestion factor. Because when we say the gate downtime growth, are we saying that what's the anticipated growth of that? Yeah. Okay, and so we certainly want to look at how crossings relate to one another on gate downtime. And then under the second column of equitable community benefits, it says this kind of binary within a half mile of a school, but we have a lot of different schools. We have little bitty private schools and we have major high schools. And I don't think we want to treat them as equal impacts. You know, for instance, in Palo Alto, we've got Pali High right on the tracks where hundreds, if not thousands, students are crossing en masse. And then we have other locations where we might have just a few students cross, but it's for a school within a half mile, and those things aren't equal. And then it's even not just the distance of a school. We have some schools where our student population doesn't cross the tracks to get to the school, even though it might be a quarter mile away from that crossing. It really doesn't matter. So I think we've got to have the category it's the impact on safe routes to schools. And one factor would be distance, but frankly, I'm not sure that's the most important one. And then on the third column, just reading my notes, on that quarter mile of another crossing, are we saying that it's higher priority if it's within a quarter mile or a lower priority?
It's a really good question, because to Nadia's earlier point about mobility, how they work together, I think part of this is the thinking about, if we think about the packaging of projects and the efficiencies. We've talked a lot about the design and construction and delivery methods efficiencies when you bundle projects. I think that's trying to get at this.
Okay, so that's whether it could be treated as a mega project, basically. Okay.
And a quarter mile seems low,
That's true.
right? Because Meadow is how 3/4 of a mile and one impacts the other. So I think the better way to write this is to the extent that two grade separations intertwingle, I think is the term usually
Really?
uses. I'm kidding, but they intermingle with each other. Yeah,
Yeah.
that they
Yeah. And then there's a consideration of related to that. They might be geographically close, but for some other reason, they're really not being combined as a single project. There might be a sequencing need that says, no, you've got to do the one, then the other, and therefore they aren't really a mega project. So we have to figure out how we incorporate that. So in some cases, that adjacency makes them a pair, and in some cases it forces their separation. And within the future 4-track area, just a note that I think Redwood City is a 4-track regardless of high-speed rail, correct? Whereas the others are not.
I think that's correct.
So is this trying to capture where it's triggered by high-speed rail? So
No, it's not. It's
It
just
would-
saying for it to support blended service, where's their future 4-track?
okay. But is Redwood City's 4-track needed for blended, or is it needed either way?
It's
Or
to
just for
support,
Caltrain? Isn't that one that isn't really needed for blended purposes?
it's correct. It's needed for Caltrain. It's driven by the needs for Caltrain, yes.
And does that place it in the same priority as if it's needed for blended?
Under this rubric, yes.
Okay. All right. So those were kind of initial thoughts. The other thing is that I haven't really looked. We have our criteria that we've established for selecting local preferred alternatives, and those are different set of criteria, but I'm not sure whether some of those might inform this discussion. And I don't know if our staff has kind of looked at it through that lens to see if there's anything on our criteria list that's, oh, wait a minute, that applies here as well as for selecting our preferred alternative. Maybe we could do that as a follow-up.
Yeah.
I haven't done that. Yeah.
Thanks for the feedback you've
bet.
given, and we'll talk more next week about it. And I would just say, yeah, I mean, I think we are thinking about open to suggestions. You know, we always thought about this as the kind of initial assessment that we would run through to understand individual crossings. But again, we, you know, also understand, to many of your points, is that a lot of this is about the funding sources, the packaging, the efficiencies for staging, et cetera. And so this is not a simple mathematical exercise. There's many components in this, and we're going to talk about that next week.
Can I quickly provide some of my thoughts on this? I just want to first say thank you for mentioning the safe routes to school. That's where our students actually walk and bike. I do think that's more critical than the 0.5 miles. Another question I have is on the first item, the recent fatal rail incident and/or fatal. I wonder if that doesn't introduce a recency bias. So that's a question about that. And so something that we use is the FRA's predictive collision, I can't remember, report ranking. And also, you know, obviously you could look at not just something recent that occurred, not that that's not really critical, but, you know, rates of incidents.
Thanks, Philip. That's a really good point. Okay. So I think
Sorry, I had one more.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, as you're looking at this corridor wide and over time, there's kind of two things that stand out to me. One is that if you don't have an inherent promise to the entire system that we are going to grade separate eventually the entire corridor, then these metrics become a kind of a tool to use against each other. And we're back in this city versus city. Like, I've had more accidents than you bit, right? So I think that that's really important that we think about that. And obviously there's difference between getting to San Jose, but then getting to Gilroy, right? And then the second I was going to say is that, again, as we get better at doing these corridor things along the next however many years this takes, there's an efficiency in, hey, someone's building an underpass, somebody else is building an underpass, a third one's building an underpass. How can we coordinate, figure out construction machines, figure out equipment? Because you'll get better and better as you do these, right? And staging of those things matters, and where all those things. And so to the extent that you can have efficiencies of that, I don't know how you create that into a metric. Good luck with that. But yeah, that's it.
So those are good points. So corridor wide segment sequencing impacts, somehow looking at that. And then I appreciate that the reason that there's really an attempt to kind of be a binary quantitative metrics is to get out of this just each city kind of competing, but I'm not sure that we can get there. Either way, having well thought criteria is valuable, even if we can't get to the point of eliminating that competition for dollars, and different cities arguing, no, ours is more important for the following reasons, and everybody will have good arguments. So I don't know that we're going to be able to get all the way to what would be ideal, which is we get it out of the hands of that kind of competition. But even if we can't get there, I think it's valuable. So, yeah.
One more thing that's not a proposed metric, but I think is something you guys should really think about. It's especially pressing in Palo Alto, but I would imagine it's true of other parts of the corridor, is that the adjacency of El Camino to the tracks impacts the ability, some cities own El Camino, like their portion of El Camino, like San Jose does, but we don't own it in Palo Alto. So whenever we do anything, we have to plug in our light system to match the timing of their lights. As we move through construction, you're going to have this problem kind of ricocheting the entire distance of the corridor. And you have the signal preemption that is timed with what's happening at El Camino. So to the extent that there could be a big period of time where these projects coordinate that sort of light timing is going to be important. Separately, I'll also say that there are portions, for example, of Alma, where Palo Alto owns Alma, but in Mountain View, it's Central Expressway, right? So it's Caltrans. you know, if Caltrans decide we're going ahead with the Rengstorff, we're going to be under construction for the next 5 years and we're just going to shut down different portions of it. And at the same time, Palo Alto decided, great, we're doing Meadow Charleston, we own it, we're going to move forward. You would have, you know, the nightmare of all traffic scenarios. So
Well,
you're going to
actually,
need to
But
coordinate.
Central is County Expressway, so it's VTA. rather
Okay,
than Caltrans.
well, so my
But-
point is you've got a bunch of network connections and you could probably figure out the Caltrans stuff because Caltrans and the cities speak often. But not enough when it comes to the timing of those lights, because from experience, it has taken us sometimes years to fix really small glitches. And so I will continue to flag that. I think it's MTC did a study years ago, years ago of trying to get the cities to take back partial control of El Camino. And you might want to raise that issue with MTC, look about what that possibility might be, because there is a lot of good things that could come from the cities being able to control their own lights. Not all parts of it, the potholes, maybe we want to leave to Caltrans, I don't know. But I'll just throw that out there as something that's not a metric, but something as you're thinking of the entire corridor, that's something that's really valuable.
Yeah, I just like to add that they are looking at the 3 different approaches and have come in to suggest to come with a coordinated approach, which is more than independent projects and then less than the system wide, but they are looking at the whole corridor with all crossings along the corridor from Gilroy to San Francisco. And this matrix will be helpful and could be evaluated on a periodic basis, and then also could be updated as they find more information in conjunction with review process through the cities and other bodies that Caltrain manages. So there's going to be a continuous and full process life cycle for them.
Okay, well, thank you on that item. We actually, I think today have a little more substance to talk about future meetings. As was mentioned earlier, Caltrain has submitted to our staff their feedback on the technical standards. And it's my understanding, Philip, that there are a ton of those. And that you're working on a comprehensive matrix of all this. So I'm glad to hear that. I guess first, can we get a copy of the, if I don't think we've gotten that to the committee members yet, a copy of the, or did we, did everybody get a copy of that?
That was sent out. Yeah, it's a summary of it.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
There's
your description of
PowerPoint? Yeah.
your description of a ton is it's a substantial amount of comments or substantial comments. So it's huge, nearly a gigabyte of in the files. So
I don't know how to weigh a gigabyte, but
that's right.
But so then, but given how that also affects our preferred alternatives combined with the 4-track, we're on an aggressive timeline to try and address that. Now, our next rail committee meeting is early December. Did you say?
Yes, it's 2 weeks from today, I believe.
So would we at least be able to have a preliminary discussion of some of the most germane parts of that? We presumably you would want to have maybe between now and then at least a preliminary meeting with Caltrain staff to see if you can narrow the open issues or get better understanding so that we're not flushing all that out at a public meeting. We narrow it down to the things that we're really concerned about or have deeper questions on. So that's a short timeline to do, to be able to meet with Caltrain staff and then whether we could have any discussion on this at the next rail committee meeting.
We are, Chair, we are doing that effort. Unfortunately, due to the Thanksgiving holidays, we are unable to have the players on the table to have that discussion. So we are looking at the first week of December to have that conversation with Caltrain. And we were hoping that we could bring it in January, a more comprehensive level of review for the rail committee. And between then and now, we could have a more internal discussions on the on the comments that we received from Caltrain.
Okay. That sounds realistic, even if I wish we could, be able to do it sooner. So then what items do we have tentatively on the agenda for December?
So currently on December, we have a presentation from Ozzy Arce and the consultant on the bicycle and pedestrian transportation plan.
Good. And then so January, we would be reviewing the technical feedback from Caltrain and any other, well, I guess it's a question then of, would we then be ready to make any recommendations to the council on at least narrowing alternatives? As I think this through, we're probably not going to be able to make a full set of recommendations, but we might be able to make certain ones and just chopping off or recommending that we chop off or include an alternative, even if it doesn't let us select a single preferred one.
I say this in hesitation, but I do think that as we review that, the technical Caltrain comments in conjunction with the forward tracking, I do think that will lead us in that direction. So I do think that's a possibility.
Oh, and it brings up a question of January meetings, because the way things stand right now in our procedures, we don't have January committee meetings. Because the mayor needs to select, reappoint or select new committee members. We have a discussion on our procedures and protocols, and I intend to bring up the question of whether the council wants to support a rollover of existing committees into January, and then come February, it would either be the same composition or a different composition of committees. In this case, because of the amount of time it takes to get a committee really up to speed on these issues, I'm hoping we'll have continuity. But as of right now, there's not a recommendation to have committee meetings in January, and I'm hoping that we'll consider that on next Monday, right? Is when we have procedures and protocols. Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. So hopefully we can fix that so that we can have a January meeting, because it would be a pretty important one.
So Chair Burt, something you might want to think about is the January meeting is going to be highly technical and dense. And I think between what we found out today with the 4 tracks and what's coming at your January meeting, if you may be able to digest it all and spit some decisions out that you could then send to full council. But if you can't, then you're pushing yourselves into a February meeting. And if the composition changed, then you have new people who have to get caught up to speed on that. So just something to consider. You might want to make it and the other thing I would say is I am worried about, there's just been a lot of new information, and how do we have to have an extra special effort to drive people either to a rail committee meeting or a city council meeting when all this gets discussed, because it's been a minute since the community's heard any of this. And you're now talking about forward tracking and, impact to a trench, and we got money that people don't know about. And so suddenly this is kicked into high gear. And so the San Francisco Creek Bridge, there's just a lot that the person who checked out of this and is now checking back in is hearing.
So when on Monday, we can, as a council, discuss the ramifications of having a meeting in January and whether we need continuity of a committee like this or want to recommend it. And then it does bring up this question of at what point in time do we need a public workshop meeting? And maybe that's something that staff can think about, and we could discuss in 2 weeks, just what we might want to schedule and when, and what content would be in that. So just let you think about it, and so that we can have a discussion on it. All good?
Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate, I think your council agendas are kind of, will also drive when you can have those meetings. And I know that come April, suddenly the budget is the only thing you guys ever talk about. It feels like for the public.
Well,
And so.
Yeah, they're more like May.
Yeah,
More like May.
but you'll have,
Yeah.
you won't have that many weeks in there, right, to get all this stuff done. And then I don't know what other decisions, if any, you have to take on whether you're going to have more AECom contracts. So that's another agenda is, there's a difference between agendizing a discussion on alternatives, but then agendizing the contract amendments that you may or may not need if you needed additional work, right? And then, yeah, so there's.
Yeah, I can certainly see that when this gets back to council, because of how much there is for the council to try to absorb, it might need to be even a special meeting, because there's a lot.
Yeah.
And lot we haven't even talked about yet, all the technical issues. So we have our work cut out for us. All right, anything else?
I think you might have understated that, so.
Okay, well, I'm not known for understatement, but thank you. All right, on that note, meeting's adjourned.
Thanks.
You.